Okay, so in responding to the video that Ido made, I'm going to talk about his argument, how compelling his counter-argument is, I'm going to critique it, and then I'm going to talk about how it impacts my own opinions. So the argument that he made started with talking about the necessity for governments to provide subsidies, him agreeing with the overall claim before he actually goes into what lobbyists should do in order to obtain approval for such subsidies. He talks about the key of compromise to solutions, and then his response to the actual question emphasizes the effect of carbon taxes rather than just on the upstream. And so that argument is an economic one, which is similar to mine. And he furthers it by saying that ultimately carbon pricing will increase prices down the line and will hurt both producers as well as consumers. And I think that also talks about how lobbyists could help reason that subsidies would not harm consumers, but that the supply chain would not be shaken up, and that is a nice alternative to carbon taxing. The narrative example that he uses is aluminum smelting as being harmful, and he incurs that high cost of carbon would negatively impact the companies and the economy. I think that argument is very similar to mine. I'll get into it in a little bit. The counter argument that he uses is that certain companies, such as BP, are the ones who are actually emitting most of the carbon, and thus they should be the ones to incur the costs rather than having the government bail them out with subsidies, which I think is a very compelling counter argument. And although we had very similar arguments, our counter arguments were very different. I talked, about a totally different aspect of how lobbyists should actually act, in saying that they should focus on environmental claims rather than on economic ones. But he actually turned it on its head and said that it's not about the government subsidizing. The issue is the government subsidizing, and companies should be the ones to actually incur the costs themselves rather than the government doing anything at all with relation to that, and that carbon taxes are just. That was the counter argument. So my critique of the overall video that he made is that he's very strong with that counter argument, but he could have done a little bit of a better job delving into his claims that he made with his argument, because he really just talks about the supply chain and reiterates the same thing a couple different ways rather than going a little deeper. I think that he could have mentioned an additional counter argument that was similar to the one that I mentioned, but I do think that the counter argument that he did use is something that I didn't consider, and I think that inclusion of that and the flaws of that argument would have made my own opinion stronger.